Jujutsu Kaisen chapter 243 has ironically given us a symbolic ending to a major character in a way that pays off prior foreshadowing as well as pays off the symbolism in Gojo and Kenjaku dying while controlling Geto's body all on the same day. However, the irony comes from the fact that Gojo fans weren't happy with this death following the "nah, I'd win" line.
You can't keep getting away with it!
And Kenjaku fans, they're not going to be happy with Yuta Okotsu killing Kenjaku, especially after Kenjaku told Gojo that Yuta Okotsu would never defeat him like how Gojo was saying. However, we'll touch on that in a little bit because there's actually quite a bit to unpack from this chapter we have to go over first. We pick up the story with Kenjaku and Takaba talking on the stage in front of the crowd, and they're continuing the comedy gags that we've seen previously, and we see more of the Japanese cultural humor being on full display as well as some of the other nods to Japanese culture, like the Momotaro Peach Boy folklore being used as a bit of a butt for some crude sexual humor, as well as some foreshadowing for some stuff dealing with Yuji. It's the last hurrah for Takaba and his curse technique, and a fitting end because of his ambition as a comedian. However, as we've seen, Takaba's curse technique is truly broken because it's more than just him making into reality things that Takaba finds to be funny and potentially manipulating the soul of Kenjaku in the process. He's also able to literally manifest a tough crowd that has its own individual personality. So what one person thinks is funny, the next person might not think is funny, which ties into Takaba's desire to make 100 out of 100 people laugh. After we get a series of random quirky comedy lines being thrown in our face, Kenjaku and Takaba start to center around the tale of Momotaro the Peach Boy, and we see Kenjaku offer conflicting answers during the skit itself, going from his mom was a single mother who had no time for him to his mom was a loving mother who always had time to read folktales to him when he was a kid, and it's delivered in a way to where you don't really know which is true and which is false, which that's what comedians tend to do, is they mix in bits of the truth into the comedic routines, all for the sake of humor. The thing here is that we at least are getting some confirmation that Kenjaku was born a male because he refers to himself as being a son of a single mother, which normally you wouldn't think anything about the gender of a villain, especially like if they got this big masculine build like Kenjaku. But since Kenjaku took over Yuji's mother, it does have some people wondering about Kenjaku's gender, and the story does address it briefly here. Yet the tale of Momotaro the Peach Boy, it wasn't brought up randomly. It's actually something kind of brilliant when you look at it. So if you're familiar with my Naruto Explained YouTube channel, you know that I've gone in detail in various videos about different Japanese folklore that's used in Naruto, in particular Momoshiki being inspired by Momotaro the Peach Boy. So I'll touch on the Peach Boy folklore here because there's a clear connection between this folklore and the circumstances with Kenjaku and Takaba here, as well as with Yuji himself. Momotaro was born the child who was delivered in a peach, who was found by this elderly couple who took him in and they raised him. Over the years, Momotaro grew up to be this big, powerful young man who eventually took down several of the demons in Onigashima, which is going to be our link back to the chapter because it was directly name dropped in the chapter itself around the time they start making all these references to Momotaro's folktales. And given that Kenjaku did take over the body of Yuji's mother and he was raised by his grandfather, it makes you wonder Gege is alluding to something about the circumstances of Yuji's birth and upbringing, because if we go back to chapter 1, Yuji's grandfather was trying to tell Yuji something specifically about his parents before he told Yuji that because he's strong he has a duty to help people. That was never really addressed at any point after this. What was so special about Yuji's parents? We know about Yuji's mother having her body taken over by Kenjaku, but what about the father? What did the grandfather know that he was trying to pass on to Yuji? This is our sign that the story is beginning to start planting seeds to finally start paying off what we got way back in chapter 1 itself. That's why Kenjaku being used to speak about Momotaro and the theory behind his birth is so important, because it's a subtle sign that, again, we're getting closer to what Yuji's grandfather was trying to tell Yuji, that was so important that he wanted to pass on the info about his parents on his deathbed. It's an interesting choice to drop that information here, buried inside of a chapter that's so heavy on comedy and building up Takaba's swan song, but it was needed because that whole conversation about the circumstances of Momotaro's birth does both tie back into chapter 1 with Yuji's grandfather, but also set the stage for Takaba dying at the end of the chapter. We start seeing signs that we're going in that direction because as Kenjaku is changing the jokes, which appear to be a very loose version of the manzai humor that you have with the Sukenboat characters, where one is the super unfocused idiot who doesn't know things that they should, or they don't follow the expected behaviors that are expected of them, and then the other is the corrector who gets super hot-headed out of annoyance with the other character. Takaba declares more than once that he doesn't want this to end. It actually makes you go back a bit to the flashback chapter of Takaba because you see just how much all this means to him, performing in front of such a huge crowd and wanting to make people laugh, even though it's not actually real. It's real to him, and while it's a dream, like all dreams, you finally end up waking up to reality. Again, while I personally felt that that flashback chapter was a bit too long, in hindsight, you can see how it was just building us up to this very moment that we have here with Kenjaku and Takaba at the end. The significance is right in your face. You have Takaba and he's in this white burial outfit as he's laying on the ground and he's thanking Kenjaku for the experience that he had, which briefly makes you wonder if at some point Takaba might have realized what was going on with his own curse technique in the end. Something that Angel warned us must never happen, but we see here is that Kenjaku's smiling at Takaba, telling him that he was actually a funny person, which now answers the question as if Kenjaku was sincerely laughing or not in the last chapter. However, we don't get to dwell on this moment for too long because Yuta Okotsu shows up in the next panel and he literally beheads Kenjaku. Now, while it does seem a bit anticlimactic that Yuta was able to hide his massive curse energy during the Takaba versus Kenjaku comedy battle, it's worth noting that while in real time, we went through several weeks and months for the build-up that came for Gojo versus Sukuna, and then you had the Kenjaku versus Takaba fight. We also know that in universe, this is only a very short period of time that took place. We also know that prior to all those events where Gojo died and Kenjaku's now in the process of dying, or at the very least in the process of having his head just being taken by Yuta, since Kenjaku did survive as a literal brain. So the idea that he's still alive is still there. However, here's the thing. We know there was a plan put together off screen that we didn't get the full information for, but we can see here exactly what happened and why Angel is so confident that Takaba was the one thing that could allow them to beat Kenjaku in the most efficient way possible. While Kenjaku was inside of Takaba's curse technique, he wasn't able to do the one thing that he was just bragging about a few chapters before Takaba showed up, which is that he wasn't able to monitor the location of curse energy of the various players, which makes a lot of sense. Kenjaku, when you go back and reread the fight, he was struggling with Takaba's technique, and there were implied lines of potential soul manipulation. It took everything Kenjaku had just to come out on top of all of this, and all that time expended and the energy expended is what allowed Yuta Okotsu to show up and get the drop on him. However, it's worth noting that right before Yuta is about to cut his head off, he uses a gravity curse technique that he got from Yuji's mother, and we see that Kenjaku's trying to do what we've seen Gojo do, which is use the reversal of his curse technique. And when you think about it, the reversal of gravity would be anti-gravity. So he would have been able to turn the tables on Yuta here, but again, because of how effective Takaba was in buying time for Yuta, Kenjaku is just too slow, which ironically, it leads to a pun for us as readers, a comedy pun, because it's basically Takaba getting the last laugh after making Kenjaku laugh previously. Now, there's also more symbolism here because Gojo died just prior to this. Kenjaku was controlling Geto's body. Kenjaku might be dying inside of Geto's body on the same day as Gojo, which is the same day that Yuta versus Geto originally happened, where Gojo had to end up killing his best friend, and that ties into Gojo warning Kenjaku before he got sealed away that he needed to remember who originally thrashed that body that you're controlling before I killed it, which was that Yuta beat down Geto. However, Kenjaku mocking Gojo for his faith in Yuta ended up biting him in the butt because we see that Gojo might have pulled a Paul Heyman from WWE. Just as Paul Heyman likes to say something isn't a prediction, it's a spoiler, Gojo low-key just did the same thing here with Kenjaku by spoiling Yuta would take him down. There's a clear long-form storytelling at play here, and Gege makes us wonder, given how he structured everything, just how much of this stuff is something that Angel planned for. Gojo not being able to defeat Sukuna, forcing Sukuna into his Heian form body, Yuji and Higuruma popping up to fight him exactly when that happened after He killed off Kashimo, Takaba, setting the stage for Yuta to take down Kenjaku immediately after Gojo's death. However, the thing with plans is that you can plan all you want, but there will always be things that you don't account for, which in this case, Kenjaku is stating that his will be inherited, which means even in defeat, things are shaping up to go the way that he wanted, which means there's a contingency that we as readers don't know as of right now. Obviously, we'll have to wait a little bit longer to see what that is, but his plan to merge Japan with Master Tengen is something that we have to wait and see how this might actually still get played off, because you don't tease something like that and not follow up on it. And Kenjaku is very, very confident that he's going to be able to pull this off.